The first bombs fell just after midnight. In a narrow wooden house in eastern Tokyo, a woman named Keiko Sato was awake, kneeling beside her two sleeping children. The air already smelled wrong, sharp, oily, unfamiliar. Outside, the night sky glowed faintly red, as if the city itself were warning what was coming. Not dozens, hundreds. American B-29 bombers filled the sky, flying low and slow, deliberately exposed. This was not a precision raid. It was something else entirely. Operation Meeting House had begun. Within minutes, incendiary bombs rained down on Tokyo's densely packed neighborhoods. They punched through rooftops and exploded into liquid fire, igniting homes built almost entirely of wood and paper. The flames spread faster than people could run. Streets became corridors of heat. Oxygen vanished. The wind fed the inferno until it became a living thing. Keiko grabbed her children and ran. Around her, the city collapsed into chaos. Families fled into the streets only to be overtaken by firestorms so intense they melted glass and asphalt. People threw themselves into canals and rivers, only to boil alive as the water heated. Others suffocated where they stood, lungs burned from the inside. By dawn, Tokyo was unrecognizable. More than 100,000 people were dead, most of them civilians. 1 million were homeless. 16 square miles of the capital had been erased in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in human history. And still, the war went on. Inside the Imperial Palace, Japan's leaders absorbed the reports in stunned silence. Entire districts gone, casualty figures climbing by the hour. And yet, there was no surrender. No public acknowledgement of defeat. The official line remained unchanged. Japan would fight on. By early 1945, the Empire of Japan was already bleeding to death. Its navy had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Its air force was depleted, forced to rely on kamikaze pilots, young men trained to die rather than win. Cities burned under relentless bombing. The population was starving, supplies were gone. But inside Tokyo's highest councils, the idea of surrender was still unthinkable. To surrender meant dishonor. To surrender meant the end of the imperial system. To surrender meant admitting that decades of sacrifice, millions of lives, had been for nothing. Across the Pacific, the United States faced its own reckoning. Plans were already underway for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. American intelligence predicted catastrophic casualties. Millions of Japanese, entire cities turned into battlefields. The war could last another year or longer. President Franklin D. Roosevelt did not live to see the choice. On April 12, 1945, he died suddenly, leaving the presidency to Harry S. Truman, a man who had been in office less than 3 months when he was informed of a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. A bomb that could end the war in a single strike. As Tokyo smoldered, Japanese civilians dug through ashes for bodies. Children searched for parents who would never be found. Propaganda promised victory through endurance. But endurance was running out. Unbeknownst to most of Japan's population, events were already in motion that would force a decision no empire had ever faced before. Not one of territory or honor, but of survival itself. The war had entered its final phase, and the next blows would not come as firestorms. They would come as something far worse. On April 25, 1945, Harry S. Truman stood in the Oval Office, staring out a window he barely noticed. It had been just 13 days since he became President of the United States. 13 days since Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death thrust him into the most powerful and most terrifying position on Earth. The war in Europe was nearing its end. But in the Pacific, the situation was far more complicated. That afternoon, Secretary of War Henry Stimson entered the room. What he told Truman would change history. Stimson spoke carefully, deliberately. He explained that the United States possessed a new weapon, one developed in total secrecy under the Manhattan Project. A single bomb, powered by atomic fission, capable of destroying an entire city in one strike. Truman listened in silence that he asked only one question. How soon can it be used? Across the ocean, Japan's leadership was trapped in its own paralysis. The Supreme War Council, 6 men who effectively controlled the empire, was deadlocked. Half believed Japan must seek peace. The other half insisted the war could still be fought to a negotiated conclusion. Their strategy rested on one final gamble: inflict such horrific casualties during an American invasion that the United States would accept terms. Every remaining aircraft would be used for suicide attacks. Civilians were being trained with bamboo spears, schoolchildren drilled for combat. The homeland would become a killing field. And yet, there was a quiet truth no one wanted to say aloud. Japan could not win. Its cities were burning faster than they could be rebuilt. Food shortages were worsening. The Navy was gone. The Air Force was hollow. And now, another threat loomed. One the Japanese leadership feared almost as much as defeat: the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Joseph Stalin had agreed to enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. They did not understand that the clock was already running. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The full weight of Allied power could now focus on Japan. American planners refined invasion scenarios that projected unimaginable losses. Intelligence reports warned that Japanese resistance would be fanatical. Truman read casualty estimates that ran into the hundreds of thousands for Americans alone. He later wrote that the decision weighed on him constantly. At 5:29 a.m., the first atomic bomb was detonated. The explosion lit the sky brighter than the sun. The shockwave shattered windows miles away. Scientists who had built the weapon stared in awe and terror at what they had unleashed. One of them quoted the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was a new era. At the Potsdam Conference later that month, Truman informed Stalin, casually, that the United States possessed a powerful new bomb. Stalin showed little reaction that he already knew. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration. Japan was ordered to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. In Tokyo, the declaration was debated, then dismissed. The government chose mokusatsu to ignore it. Silence. They believed they still had time. They were wrong. The decision Japan refused to make was now about to be forced upon it by a weapon the world had never seen, and a moment humanity would never escape. The next chapter would begin with a single aircraft and a single city. At 2:45 a.m., the crew of the B-29 Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian. The aircraft climbed steadily into the dark Pacific sky, its engines humming with an almost deceptive calm. On board were 12 men, each trained for months, each aware that this mission was different, but none fully grasped how different it truly was. Colonel Paul Tibbets sat at the controls. He had named the plane after his mother. Beneath the aircraft's bomb bay rested a single device, codenamed Little Boy. It was unlike any weapon ever built. No test of this exact design had ever been conducted. When it was released, the world would find out if it worked. Or if it didn't. As dawn approached, Hiroshima came into view. It was a military city, headquarters of the Japanese Second General Army, but also a place of ordinary life. Streetcars ran, children walked to school, doctors began their rounds. Air raid sirens sounded briefly, then fell silent. At 8:15 a.m., Little Boy was released. It fell for 43 seconds. Then, 1,900 feet above the city, the bomb detonated. The flash came first, a blinding white light hotter than the surface of the sun. Shadows were burned permanently into stone. People closest to the epicenter were vaporized instantly, their bodies erased in a fraction of a second. Then came the blast. A shockwave tore through Hiroshima at over 700 miles per hour. Buildings disintegrated, concrete folded, steel bent like paper. Human beings were thrown through the air or crushed beneath collapsing structures. And then came the fire. A massive firestorm consumed the city, feeding on splintered wood, ruptured gas lines, and the heat of the explosion itself. Those who survived the initial blast staggered through streets that no longer existed, skin hanging from their arms, eyes burned blind, clothes fused to flesh. By the end of the day, Hiroshima was gone. An estimated 70,000 people were dead within hours. Tens of thousands more would die in the days, weeks, and years that followed, from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness no one yet understood. In Washington, confirmation arrived quickly. The weapon had worked. President Truman addressed the nation, calling the atomic bomb a means to end the war swiftly and save lives. He warned Japan that more destruction would follow if it did not surrender. In Tokyo, confusion reigned. Communication with Hiroshima had ceased entirely. Reconnaissance flights reported a city flattened by a single bomb, but Japanese scientists struggled to comprehend the scale. Some dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others feared the truth. Still, the Supreme War Council did not meet immediately. There was no emergency session, no surrender order. The logic that had governed Japan's war efforts still held firm. Endure one more blow. Then another, then force negotiations. 3 days later, before Japan could fully process what had happened, the second blow fell. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. That same night, Soviet armies surged into Manchuria, annihilating Japan's elite Guandong army with overwhelming force. The final diplomatic hope, Soviet mediation, vanished in a single announcement. Japan now faced destruction from every direction. Yet even then, surrender was not guaranteed. The leadership remained divided. Some argued that Hiroshima was a singular event, that the Americans could not possess more such weapons. Others believed continuing the war was preferable to unconditional surrender. They were running out of time. At dawn on August 9th, another B-29 took to the sky, and the decision Japan had avoided for months, years, was about to be forced, not by debate or diplomacy, but by annihilation repeated. The weather over Kokura was wrong. Thick clouds obscured the target, drifting stubbornly across the city just as the B-29 Boxcar approached its bombing run. Major Charles Sweeney circled once. Then again, fuel was running low. Orders were clear. Visual confirmation was required. No target, no drop. Minutes slipped away. With Kokura still hidden, Sweeney made the decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Below, Nagasaki was not prepared. Unlike Hiroshima, the city was nestled between steep hills, its factories and neighborhoods spread unevenly along narrow valleys. It was a vital industrial center, home to shipyards, arms production, and Mitsubishi plants. But it was also a city of families, churches, and workers beginning another day of war. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell. Fat Man detonated 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley. The explosion was immense, more powerful than Hiroshima's, but the surrounding terrain partially contained the blast. Even so, the destruction was catastrophic. Factories vanished. Entire neighborhoods were erased. The heat ignited fires across the valley floor, while the shockwave crushed buildings into themselves. Those closest to the epicenter died instantly. Others staggered through smoke and flame, burned and bleeding, unsure what had happened or why the world had suddenly ended around them. Medical facilities were destroyed, doctors were killed or wounded. Survivors searched for loved ones among ruins that offered no answers. By the end of the day, tens of thousands were dead. 2 cities, 2 atomic bombs. And still, Japan did not immediately surrender. Inside Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened an emergency session. The atmosphere was tense, almost unreal. Reports arrived from Nagasaki. Confirmation of Soviet advances in Manchuria poured in. The empire now faced annihilation from the air, invasion from the north, and the certainty of invasion from the south. The council split evenly. 3 members argued for surrender, if the emperor could be preserved. 3 insisted on continuing the war, demanding conditions that the Allies would never accept. The deadlock was absolute. For the first time in Japan's modern history, the decision could not be resolved within the military leadership. It now required the voice of the emperor himself. That night, Emperor Hirohito was briefed in detail, not in abstractions or propaganda, but in facts. Cities destroyed by single bombs. The Soviet Union now an enemy. The homeland defenseless against what would come next. Hirohito listened quietly. Those present later recalled that he appeared calm, almost distant. But when he spoke, his words carried a weight no general could challenge. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said. It was a careful phrase, but the meaning was unmistakable. The next day, August 10th, Japan informed the Allies it was willing to surrender, on one condition: the preservation of the imperial institution. The response came swiftly. The Allies would accept surrender, but the emperor would be subject to the authority of the supreme commander of the Allied powers. There were no guarantees. Once again, Japan's leadership hesitated. On the night of August 14th, As plans were made for the emperor to record a surrender message, a group of junior officers attempted a coup. They seized parts of the imperial palace, searching desperately for the recording. They believed surrender was betrayal, and that stopping it might save the nation's honor. They failed. By dawn, the rebellion collapsed. The recording survived that on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast across Japan for the first time. His words were formal, archaic, almost gentle, but the message was unmistakable. Japan would endure the unendurable. The war was over. Yet even as the fighting ceased, the meaning of what had just occurred, what humanity had unleashed upon itself, was only beginning to sink in. And there would be no going back. On August 15, 1945, the sound that filled Japan was not celebration. It was silence. In homes across the country, families gathered around radios, listening to a voice they had never heard before. Emperor Hirohito spoke softly, formally, in language so refined that many struggled to understand every word. But the meaning was unmistakable. The war had ended. For a nation raised on sacrifice, obedience, and the promise of ultimate victory, the moment was disorienting. Some wept openly, others sat motionless. Soldiers lowered their heads, civilians stared at the floor. The unthinkable had happened. Japan had surrendered. Across the Pacific, the reaction was immediate and explosive. In the United States, crowds flooded city streets. Church bells rang, factories shut down early. Soldiers embraced strangers. The war that had defined an entire generation was finally over. But in Japan, surrender carried a different weight. The government moved quickly to maintain order. There were fears, real fears, of mass suicides, of military units refusing to comply, of chaos spreading through a country already devastated by bombing and starvation. Propaganda was hastily replaced with messages of calm and obedience to the emperor. Not everyone accepted the new reality. Some officers killed themselves rather than surrender. Others attempted to continue fighting. In remote areas, isolated units would not lay down arms for weeks, even months. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Under a gray sky, Japanese representatives stepped forward, signed the documents, and bowed. Allied officers followed. Cameras clicked. History closed a chapter. The world exhaled again. But the consequences of the atomic bombings were only beginning to unfold. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors, soon called hibakusha, began to suffer from mysterious illnesses. Hair fell out. Burns refused to heal. People who appeared to recover suddenly collapsed weeks later. The long shadow of the bomb revealed itself slowly, cruelly. Globally, the reaction was complex. Some saw the atomic bomb as a necessary evil, an act that prevented a far bloodier invasion. Others saw it as an unforgivable atrocity. One truth was undeniable. Humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself. As occupation forces entered Japan under General Douglas MacArthur, a new chapter began. The emperor remained on the throne, but no longer as a divine figure. The military was dismantled. A new constitution was drafted. Democracy was introduced to a nation that had never known it in this form. Japan would be rebuilt, but it would never forget. The war had ended not with victory, but with revelation. The revelation that modern warfare had crossed into something beyond control. And as the ruins were cleared and the dead were counted, a deeper question lingered over the world. Not just whether the atomic bomb had ended the war, but whether it had changed war forever. The first American troops entered Japan not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They arrived to a nation stripped bare, railways twisted, factories silent, cities hollowed out by fire and blast. Tokyo stood scarred and exhausted. Hiroshima and Nagasaki existed as warnings more than places, their ruins radiating a quiet horror that photographs could not fully capture. At the center of this new reality stood General Douglas MacArthur. His task was unprecedented. Occupy a defeated empire without tearing it apart, dismantle militarism without destroying the nation, and rebuild a society that had been shaped by obedience and war. One decision defined everything that followed. The emperor would remain. Against the advice of many, MacArthur chose not to try Hirohito for war crimes. Removing him, he believed, would risk chaos. perhaps even civil war. Instead, the emperor would be transformed from a divine ruler into a constitutional monarch, a living bridge between Japan's past and its future. On January 1st, 1946, Hirohito renounced his divinity. It was a moment as radical as surrender itself. Across Japan, people struggled to reconcile the emperor they had worshipped with the man who now claimed he was human. For many, it was liberation. For others, disorientation. For all, it marked the end of an era that had shaped their lives from birth. The occupation moved swiftly. Japan's military was dismantled, weapons were destroyed, officers were dismissed, war industries were converted or shut down entirely. A new constitution was drafted, enshrining democratic governance, and, most controversially, Article 9, Japan's renunciation of war as a sovereign right. Never again, it promised, at the same time, justice arrived in courtrooms. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East put Japan's wartime leaders on trial. Prime ministers, generals, and admirals were forced to confront the consequences of their decisions. Evidence of atrocities, massacres, forced labor, medical experimentation filled the record. 7 were sentenced to death. Yet even these trials left wounds unresolved. Many perpetrators were never charged. The suffering of civilians across Asia, China, Korea, Southeast Asia, often faded behind the larger narrative of Japan's defeat. History, once again, proved uneven. For ordinary Japanese citizens, daily life remained a struggle. Food was scarce, inflation soared. Families bartered for survival, black markets thrived. American soldiers walked streets once patrolled by imperial troops. Cultural shock ran in both directions. Occupiers and occupied studying one another with curiosity, fear, and occasional compassion. And beneath it all, the memory of August 1945 lingered. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced stigma. Radiation sickness was poorly understood. Many were denied jobs or marriage, feared as contagious or cursed. Their stories were whispered, not broadcast. The bomb was something to endure quietly. Meanwhile, the world was changing fast. The alliance that had defeated Japan fractured almost immediately. The United States and the Soviet Union eyed each other with suspicion. Nuclear weapons, once secret, became the centerpiece of a new global balance. The age of total war had given way to the age of total annihilation. Japan, ironically, found itself at the center of this new order, not as an enemy, but as a strategic ally. As the Cold War deepened, American policy shifted from punishment to reconstruction. Economic reforms accelerated, industry returned. Education expanded. Within a few years, Japan began an astonishing recovery. But recovery did not mean forgetting. The war had stripped away illusions about empire, about destiny, about victory at any cost. What remained was a society forced to rebuild itself on the ruins of belief. The bombs had ended the war. The occupation was reshaping peace. The war was over, but the fear it unleashed was only beginning. Within a few years, it became something else entirely. A precedent. The United States no longer held a monopoly on nuclear power. The weapon that had ended World War II now became the foundation of a new global standoff. The Cold War had turned nuclear. Across the world, governments began to plan not just for war, but for extinction. Cities mapped evacuation routes. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in classrooms. Concrete bunkers were built beneath capitals. Civil defense films taught families how to survive a blast that, in reality, few could. The lesson of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not restraint. It was escalation. Nuclear weapons grew more powerful. Hydrogen bombs replaced atomic ones. Yields increased from thousands of tons to millions. One bomb became 10.10 became hundreds. By the 1950s, the world possessed the means to erase itself many times over. And yet, none were used in war. The destruction of Japan had revealed a terrifying paradox. Nuclear weapons were too powerful to use and too dangerous to abandon. This balance became known as deterrence. The logic was simple and horrifying. Peace would be maintained not by trust, but by the certainty that any nuclear war would end civilization itself. Mutually assured destruction, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than cities. They became warnings that in Japan, memory took on a unique role. Annual ceremonies honored the dead. Peace parks were built where ruins once stood. Survivors told their stories, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. The Hibakusha became living witnesses to a future humanity desperately hoped to avoid. But remembrance was not universal. Elsewhere, the bomb was discussed in abstractions, megaton yields, blast radii, strategic advantages. The human cost was reduced to calculations. War, once again, risked becoming distant. Japan's post-war identity hardened in contrast. The nation that had once pursued empire embraced pacifism. Its constitution rejected war. Its people rebuilt cities not around factories of death, but around commerce, culture, and technology. Within a generation, Japan transformed from defeated enemy to economic powerhouse. Yet beneath the prosperity, the past remained present. School textbooks debated responsibility. Politicians argued over memory. Visits to war shrines sparked controversy across Asia. The question of how to remember the war, who suffered, who caused suffering, never fully settled. And globally, the nuclear shadow persisted. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to proxy wars fought under atomic umbrellas, the world came repeatedly to the edge. Each time, the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hovered silently in the background, unspoken but understood. They were proof of what modern war could become, proof that there was no victory worth that cost. World War II had ended with surrender, but the age it created had no such ending. The final legacy of the war was not peace, but vigilance, and the understanding that humanity now lived with a power it could never uninvent, only choose whether to unleash. That choice, born in August 1945, remains with us still. As the decades passed, the war receded into history, but it never truly faded. In Hiroshima, the ruins of the Jinbaku Dome were left standing, skeletal and exposed, exactly where the atomic bomb had detonated. Parks replaced rubble. Schools rose where firestorms once raged. Each August 6th, crowds gathered in silence as bells rang and paper lanterns floated down the river, carrying the names of the dead. Nagasaki did the same. Memory became ritual. But memory was never simple. In Japan, the question of responsibility remained deeply contested. Many civilians experienced the war primarily as victims of bombing, hunger, and annihilation. For them, Hiroshima and Nagasaki symbolized suffering beyond scale, proof of war's absolute cruelty. Yet across Asia, memory told a different story. In China, Korea, the Philippines, and across Southeast Asia, the war was remembered not as a tragedy that happened to Japan, but as one Japan had inflicted. Occupation, forced labor, massacres, and sexual slavery left wounds that never fully healed. For these nations, Japanese victimhood could not be separated from Japanese aggression. Were they an unavoidable necessity that ended the war? Or an unforgivable crime against civilians? The debate never settled. In the United States, the bomb was often framed as a tragic but necessary act, one that saved countless lives by preventing invasion. Between these interpretations lay a moral gulf that history has never bridged. Even among those who built the bomb, certainty eroded. Scientists who once believed the weapon would end war watched as nuclear arsenals multiplied. Some became activists, warning against the very creation they had helped unleash. Others retreated into silence, haunted by what had been done. The Hibakusha carried the weight longest. Many lived decades under discrimination, feared for their health, for their children, for the stigma attached to radiation. Yet they spoke, again and again, to classrooms, to conferences, to the world. Their message was simple: this must never happen again. And still, the weapons remained. Nuclear tests scarred deserts and oceans. New nations sought the bomb. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols used by everyone: activists, politicians, generals, often stripped of their human faces. Numbers replaced names, strategy replaced suffering. Yet history resisted abstraction. Photographs survived, diaries survived, shadows burned into stone survived. They reminded the world that behind every decision, every doctrine, every justification, there were lives interrupted in a single flash of light. The war that broke Japan had also broken something else: humanity's belief that progress and morality always move together. What followed was not clarity, but responsibility. And that responsibility, how to remember, how to judge, how to choose restraint over power, would define the final legacy of World War II. One part remained, not about what happened, but about what it means now. World War II did not truly end in 1945. It ended on paper. It ended in ceremonies. It ended with signatures and speeches and promises of never again. But in reality, it continued, embedded in the structures, fears, and decisions that shaped the modern world. The final days of the war against Japan were not just an ending, they were a transformation. For the first time in history, humanity possessed the ability to erase itself in an instant. The atomic bomb did not merely defeat an enemy, it rewritten the meaning of power. Victory was no longer measured solely in territory or armies, but in restraint. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on judgment. Japan became the proof that a nation shattered by total war, then rebuilt under an entirely different philosophy. Its post-war identity, pacifist, democratic, technologically driven, stood in direct opposition to the militarism that had once consumed it. The cities that were burned and bombed became centers of innovation and culture. The empire that sought domination became a voice, however imperfect, for peace. Yet the warning Japan carried was never meant to be uniquely Japanese. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not historical anomalies. They were demonstrations of what modern science, fused with political will, could unleash. The bombs revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. The line between victory and annihilation had disappeared. Every nuclear crisis since, every standoff, every threat, every test, has unfolded in the shadow of August 1945. Leaders speak of deterrence, of balance, of security. But beneath those words lies the same fragile hope that no one will ever choose to cross that line again. History offers no guarantees. It only offers memory. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki understood this better than anyone. As their numbers dwindled, their urgency grew. They did not speak as historians or politicians. They spoke as witnesses. As proof. They asked the world not to remember the bomb, but to remember the people. World War II ended with Japan's surrender, but its final lesson remains unresolved. It is not a lesson about good and evil alone. It is about responsibility, about what humanity does with the power it creates. From that moment forward, the future was no longer guaranteed by victory, only by choice. And that choice, made once in fire, waits silently in every generation that follows.